The session is being recorded. Thank you. Welcome everyone for joining us to our webinar today. Very special webinar to finish the semester here in Brazil at the University of Salvador. We have the pleasure to have Professor Federico Finchelstein, a historian and professor at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and Carolina, our undergrad student, will introduce Professor Finchelstein. Then Professor Finchelstein will deliver his remarks about, that's very interesting. We are very eager to hear from him because we are here in Brazil with Bolsonaro as president, and Trump was defeated electorally in the United States. So we have a lot to try to understand what's happening. Is populism rising? Is populism declining? So some questions that probably Professor Finchelstein will take a few insights. So Carolina, please introduce our special guest, Professor Finchelstein.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, first of all, welcome everyone to our last webinar of 2020. And we would like to thank you for being with us so far. I am Carolina, leader of NERI Events Committee, and I will be here today with Johanna, leader of NERI Organizing Committee, and with our professor Felippe Ramos, coordinator of NERI. Today we have this special guest, Professor Federico Finchelstein. Professor, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being with us in this last webinar. It is a pleasure to have you here, and I will introduce you. Federico Finchelstein, born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, he is professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York, where he directs the Janey Program for Latin American Studies. And he is recognized worldwide for his books on fascism and populism, as the book A Brief History of Fascist Lies in 2020 and From Fascism to Populism in History in 2017. By the way, these books are available in Portuguese if you would like to buy. He graduated from the University of Buenos Aires and a doctorate from Cornell University in New York. Professor, once again, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Carolina. Thank you so much, Johanna, and of course, Felipe. Thank you for inviting me also to present today. I'm sorry that this presentation has to be online rather than, me going there, because although I visit Brazil a lot, I've never been in your university and your city. Again, I hope we can talk specifically about Brazil today, in addition to Trump and the global dimensions, because it's such a, I would say, a key case, as well as a country that in my own case, as a neighbor, is very dear to me. And I have been exactly, I think, almost 1 year ago, I have been in Fortaleza, at the University of Ceará, presenting on these topics in a seminar, and then as in other situations in Brazil, I learn a lot as well, and I'm sure today I would have the opportunity also to learn from you. So basically, we can start with a couple of questions which I think are central to our situation today. Questions that I think are especially important for Brazil, or the future of Brazil. Because one of the questions that we should ask today, and Felipe just mentioned, the key fact, of course, that Trump has lost the election, is that what happens then? What happens when this project against democracy, or the project that profoundly denigrate and lower the quality of democracy in a country, I mean, what is the work of reconstruction that is needed? And a lot of questions, of course, will be facing the new Biden administration. I mean, because what is clear is that, I mean, and I think probably an example for Brazil as well was that Biden was able to defeat Trumpism, to defeat this extreme populism that is very close to fascism. And I will return to, to a more historical explanation of this matter in a few minutes. But before, I wanted to address this issue that we are facing now in the United States, and an issue that hopefully you will be facing at some point in Brazil, which is how to rebuild democracy after all these attacks by leaders that are in power, that they are able to denigrate and downplay the nature of a democracy from a very powerful position, which is that of being, in Brasilia or in Washington. And what is clear is that if Biden was able to win, a big reason behind, the defeat of Trumpism is that Biden was able to assemble what I would call a popular front or a coalition, which was very close to being an anti-fascist coalition. Not necessarily because Trump was fascist, he is not, but rather because Trump represented the danger of fascism. And in this sense, I mean, people that voted for Biden belong to not only to the Democratic Party but also to the Republican Party. People that decided to put aside their big ideological differences, I would say, and vote for vote for Biden. So people on the right, people on the left, and people on the center. And that's why when I am often interviewed by Brazilian media, I say, well, from the perspective of, let's say, fascism and populism, what Bolsonaro represents makes people like Cardoso and Lula look very similar, or at least closer between themselves than let's say with Bolsonaro. And of course, I know that to say this in Brazil sounds extremely strange, but still, I think if you compare like people on the right and people, let's say, conservatives and center and left in Brazil, they share in common much more than that they share with Bolsonaro in many ways. And often what is interesting is that all these representatives or politicians see themselves as being extremely different to Bolsonaro, but sometimes they are not able to see that also people that are not like them might be equally different to Bolsonaro. And I think this was understood in the US. And in that sense, you have, as I said, like from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders to never Trumpers. I mean, the Republicans of Project Lincoln. I mean, the widow of McCain. I mean, former politicians in the Republican Party, and of course the center. So and again, I think this was key to defeat Trumpism, as probably it will be key in Brazil if Bolsonaro is to be defeated. To say the least, this should start, this should start, or perhaps even should have started before. I mean, and again, I'm an outsider, so I'm saying things that that are not as informed as you are. But from my perspective, I already saw actually very clearly that in the previous presidential election in Brazil, the PP and Ciro Gomes, I mean, they share many more things than. I mean, they share many more things that they sought, particularly when confronted with Bolsonaro. But I think this will apply to other even center-right parties as well, including the Tucanos and so on. So again, these are issues that perhaps we can learn from the US, if you will. But on the other hand, I mean, and of course, this situation, as you know, happened in France when there was this kind of cordon sanitaire or like a sanitary cordon, and yet it was different because it's not that the people that, the authoritarians were in power, but still what you saw is that when the left in that case supported the right in order to defeat Le Penism, what you saw is that at some point that was not enough, and once the authoritarians were defeated, it was very hard to maintain an important level of popular support among sectors that have voted against the authoritarian leader. Because, and to quote Borges, the Argentine writer, when he was talking about anti-Peronism, he said, "What unites us is not love but fear." And of course that explains, I think, the anti-Trump coalition as it might explain an anti-Bolsonaro coalition. But still, once the leader is defeated, that might not be enough. Like, important reforms need to take place, and we cannot accept, I think, a kind of similarly mythical idea that before Trump wanted to make America great again, America was already great. Because, I mean, of course, there were a lot of problems that also explain why these authoritarian leaders won. And I think this equally, if not more so, applies to Brazil, where there was a big political crisis, a big economic crisis, and so on and so forth. So, of course, these authoritarian leaders were able to exploit this situation by presenting themselves as being anti-political, when in fact and they say we are not typical politicians, which in the case of Bolsonaro is very curious because he has been there, a long time as a kind of, let's say, a professional politician. That is to say, a person whose profession and whose legal income comes from politics. So the point is that obviously then you see other issues which many of these leaders share, but also sadly they share this with other leaders as well, which is the issue of corruption. But in any case, when we think about what is new that these leaders represented, we should also think hard about the previous situation. Again, I think in Brazil that situation might be easier than in the case of the US, because nobody will claim that the situation in Brazil before Bolsonaro was great, but rather than important things needed to be changed in order to address social, economic, and political crisis. In any case, I mean, this is perhaps the present of the US and hopefully the future of Brazil, which is to say, what a kind of popular front, an alliance between parties against the anti-democratic party or movement or leader can do after it wins. Sadly, Brazil is not there yet, and I wanted to ask you, perhaps you can tell me more, I'm worried about the fact that according to some media, Bolsonaro is even enjoying higher levels of popularity, which, as seen from the outside, is hard to understand, because what you have is a terrible option, which is either a mismanagement of a terrible economic and sanitary crisis, or worse, a management of the crisis in order to produce the death of people that are regarded as, as not necessary to the nation. Because what you see is that in this endorsement of, and this happened in the US, by the way, as well, I mean, this endorsement of propaganda and lies by the leader, I mean, regarding the pandemic, has generated impressive levels of death. So basically, this idea of that lies and propaganda produce and create death. In that sense, it's not a coincidence that countries like the United States and Brazil are holding records. I mean, and then you should add India to the example as well, where you have a similar leader in Modi. I mean, these countries are having horrible records regarding levels of people infected and level of people dying. I mean, so how in that context a leader like Bolsonaro can generate more support? To me, it's hard to understand. Perhaps you can explain this to me better. But eventually, I think, given the fact that it is clear that either historically or in the present, these kind of leaders are doing terrible jobs in, in terms of guiding the nation. Eventually, they can be defeated, and they will be defeated. But then the question, of course, that we are facing in the United States is what comes next. And what comes next cannot be the same. It cannot be the kind of I would say technocratic, elitist, and neoliberal politics. Anyway, so that's the present. Now let me address a little more of the past. Now, when addressing the past, of course, we ask the question of what is new. And what is new, I mean, includes or involves important dimensions. I mean, of course, if you ask Bolsonaro or Trump or Modi in India, I mean, they will tell you that they are completely new, that their form of politics is a turning point in the history of the country and perhaps even the world, that there is no leader, although they admire dictators and even fascists, there is no leader like them. So we should take, of course, this not with a grain of salt, but with with big doubts, let's say, with a very harsh critical look on claims, which are, of course, propaganda claims. On the other hand, we need to recognize that what is new is that their brand of populism presents new dimensions. Because, of course, I think I will say this: never in the history of populism there was such a level of propaganda and lies, such a level of glorification of violence and militarization of politics, such a level of xenophobia, hatred for what is different or what is regarded as different or what is perceived as different, and even racism and misogyny and homophobia. I mean, all these politics of hate, it's not that they did not exist in previous populist cases, but they were not as extreme and they were not as occupying the center of politics. So this is new in the history of populism. And then, I mean, this allows me, or this moves me into a different direction, which is to very, very briefly explain, I mean, the differences between fascism and populism. So fascism is it's all the things that I have just mentioned, but also it involves dictatorship as a model. I mean, in the sense that there can be dictatorship without fascism, but there is no fascism without dictatorship. So fascism is always dictatorship. So far, populism is not. So if fascism was, again, it involved incredibly high levels of repression, I would say powerful, overpowering even machines of propaganda. The idea that hate for everything that is different, and that includes, of course, all these forms of hatred that I just mentioned, and central in fascism, racism, but also homophobia and misogyny and other forms of hate, were at the center of politics. And of course, when we talk about dictatorship, we should talk about totalitarian forms of dictatorship, meaning dictatorships that basically break the distinction between what is public and what is private, and also break the distinction of what is the state and what is society. So the unification of these spheres means that fascism is, of course, totalitarian. So, I mean, fascism is other things, of course, but all these things derive from these four characteristics, I would say. Because fascism is imperialist, fascism is warmongering, but that derives from this emphasis on violence as a source of power. And let me stop there for a second. In other forms of politics, including, I would say, socialism or communism, liberalism, and even populism, power derives, it's a derivation of the monopoly of violence, right? But in that sense, I mean, and they're all Weberian in that sense. I mean, what is power but the monopoly of violence? What is a powerful state? The state that is able to monopolize violence. In that sense, when you see that there is extra, let's say, para-state violence in Brazil, then you say from a Weberian perspective, then the Brazilian state is not that powerful. When you see that, someone like Bolsonaro promotes extra-legal violence or even paralegal violence, then you think, from a Weberian perspective, that means that Bolsonaro is not that powerful. But in the Weberian perspective, then power is a derivation or an outcome of the state's monopoly of violence. Fascism has a different perspective. Actually, perhaps Bolsonaro might have a different perspective on this, which is that in fascism, yes, violence is a source of power, and they also agree with the Weberian perspective. In the sense that the state, meaning themselves, need to have the monopoly of violence. But the big difference is that then they think that power emanates from the execution or exercising of that violence. Meaning, yes, you have the monopoly of violence, but then you use the violence towards minorities, towards people that think or behave or are different. And eventually, after this internal repression, then you go outward. Then fascists go outward, outside, externally, and then you have war. So a fascist state is a state that is able to first provide incredible levels of internal repression, sometimes, even in civil wars, and eventually move that towards, conventional war in that sense, in terms of conquering other nations. Because a state that is powerful or a leader that is powerful is the leader that is able to exercise that violence. So restraining violence, and here there is where they break with Weber, and of course they break with other political traditions, is that exercising violence means for the fascists amplifying their power. Now, of course, this is why if you compare fascism with other traditions, say for example communism or liberalism, I mean, the ideological dimension is completely different. Perhaps sometimes not necessarily the practice. I mean, there is no possibility that in public someone like Nixon or Kennedy or Johnson will say, we are, we are killing the Vietnamese because that makes us better people. They will kill the Vietnamese and they will present that war as a means to a good end, but never as an end in itself. War cannot be an end in itself. Violence cannot be an end in itself. It's not that in that way, if you remember Apocalypse Now, Robert Duvall playing this, this colonel, I think, who says, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. I mean, that's a fascist statement, meaning that he likes to kill people. He loves the experience of killing people. I mean, from a liberal or communist perspective, I mean, in terms of ideology, that is not admissible, because power and violence do not work that way, at least ideologically. That's why you need to distinguish between the function and the ideology. In the sense that Stalin will kill a lot of people, but will never say that killing these people was an end in itself. Perhaps repression was a means to a greater end, but repression itself was not something palatable or something that he enjoyed. That's why, for example, and I mentioned this, and it's mentioned in a famous movie, that Lenin said that he could not listen to Beethoven during the moments of high repression, because he could not associate something that needed to be done in terms of red terror with beauty. Whereas, as you know, the fascists, on the other hand, they love listening to Beethoven in the context of concentration camps, because they see or they saw that those levels of repression as something beautiful, something aesthetically and ethically beautiful, even according to this weird ethics, which we will not call ethics in any way from our perspective. That is to say that liberalism and communism are children of the Enlightenment, so they will never admit or at least violence will always appear as a contradiction with the ends, which are not violent. I mean, the idea of the monopoly of violence is to provide stability, whereas in fascism, stability is a problem in itself, because violence needs to be constantly reproduced in order to generate more and more power. If they don't do that, they will feel decadent, as opposed to powerful. So you see that in this sense, fascism radically breaks with other political traditions. Now, after fascism was defeated, there were fascists and dictators that decided that, I mean, some people decided that they wanted to continue with that, and we should call them neo-fascists. And they tried, to continue the fascist model, and they were never successful in politics. They never reached power again. At least, sometimes they did, or they will do as member of coalitions, for example, in Italy, but not necessarily, in terms of leading the nation. But other people that came from that tradition, or that sometimes were fellow travelers of that tradition, decided that, those legacies of fascism and dictatorship needed to be reformulated. And that's what I call modern populism in power. Because populists, and this is what I talk about in my book, which is, well, I don't see let me see. Here it is. So here is the Portuguese edition of this book. Do fascismo ao populismo na historia. What I say here in that book is that by doing so, populists reformulated fascism in a democratic key. And by doing so, they cease to be fascists. They stop being fascists. Because once you engage in democracy, you are leaving behind a key dimension of fascism, which is dictatorship. So if, as in the most famous cases, Germany and Italy, fascists use democracy from within to destroy democracy from within. They destroy democracy from within to create a dictatorship. I mean, and I was reading, I'm this kind of person that reads, sometimes terrible texts in the morning. I mean, it's not that I enjoy them, like that guy that liked the smell of napalm in the morning. But yesterday, in fact, for something that I'm writing, I was reading this terrible book. I mean, let's see if we can see it. And I was reading it looking for something different because I was working on my next book on myth. And I came upon this interesting phrase by Hitler in which he said, to the extent that we will participate in parliament, we should never forget that we hate parliament and eventually we will be able to destroy parliament. And yet they will participate of parliament, meaning in elections there will be Nazi representative in Congress. But he said this even before they came to power, and when they were presenting these candidates in elections, he said, but we don't believe in this. And and in fact, we will destroy it when we can. So fascism destroyed democracy from within to create a dictatorship. Now, the populists did the opposite. They were dictators. Yes, I will address, Enrique, I will address this question. If you perhaps give me like 10 more minutes and I will finish my presentation, and then we can engage all these questions. Of course, the paramilitary dimension is very important. No, please, what I will ask is please remember your question so we can ask it in 10 minutes. What I was saying is that then, okay, let me say it again. Fascism destroyed democracy from within in order to create a dictatorship. So what were the populists doing after 1945, and especially in countries like Brazil and Argentina? The populists had been dictators, some of them very close to fascism, or some of them even fascist. And after 1945, they decided to become candidates in elections and try to engage in democracy. They had destroyed democracy before. I mean, Vargas created a new state in which democracy had no place in the 1930s. Perón in Argentina, Juan Domingo Perón, basically he was the strong man in a junta, in a military junta. And what did they do? Perón, for example, and he was a fascist. He had no problem in admitting it. But what did they do? So the opposite of what the fascists did. So what Perón did, again, he was the strongman in a military junta. He called for general elections, and he won those democratic elections. And in that sense, they did the opposite. So they destroyed dictatorship from within in order to create a democracy. Now, of course, that democracy came with a baggage and or remnants of what they had been before. And in that sense, populist democracies were authoritarian. So they involve both, like authoritarianism and democratic elements. Let's say fascism and democracy. But when you have this combination of fascism and democracy, you no longer have fascism, because there is no democratic dimension in fascism. So that's why you have modern populism, which is, as I said, is an authoritarian form of democracy. Why? Because in populism, what you have is this idea that the leader has been voted by the people. And so far, this is a democratic idea, because we, in all democratic traditions, there is the idea that a majority that voted for a particular candidate represents the people. But as Pierre Rosanvallon, the French theory, says, that is a metaphor that we use in order to understand or to give legitimacy to the winner. But nobody confuses the metaphor for the reality in democracy, because if you confuse the metaphor with the reality, then you think that your followers represent the people, and the people that didn't vote that didn't vote for you were the anti-people. They were not true Brazilians, they were not true Argentines, and they are not representing the will of the people. And only the leader in a populist democracy represents the will of the people. So that's why this has some anti-democratic connotations, in the sense that, what about those that didn't vote for you? And the idea is that those are generally represented as, there is no good place for opposition in the populist model, because what you have is that those that do not follow the leader, they may be true Argentines or true Brazilians or true Americans, but they don't recognize their own interests. So in a way, they are idiots, people with a false consciousness that they should be supporting the leader, but they don't. So yes, they are Brazilians, they are Argentines, but they don't understand what is good for them. So that's one option for the opposition. They are idiots. The other option is worse, and in the populist model appears all the time. This is not the case that these are Brazilians or Americans that do not understand what is good for them. Rather, they understand what are the needs of the nations, but they are traitors. So they are against the needs of the nation. So here, this is in the sense that, on the one hand, in the populist model, there are elections, but those that are not supporting the leader are presented as either idiots or traitors, rather than legitimate political actors. On the other hand, often this stops at the rhetorical level, at the speech level, and these people are not necessarily persecuted, imprisoned, or killed, like in massive ways, right, as the fascists did. So, in short, populism in history was a reformulation of fascism in a democratic key, or in democratic terms, and in that sense, populists left behind four key elements of fascism. They left behind, of course, dictatorship, because when they created these authoritarian democracies, they were not dictatorships. And for those of us, which I'm sure I'm older than most of you, Perhaps not, but that's my assumption. The first years of my life, I live under a dictatorship, and I can assure you that these kind of conversations that we are having were not possible in those situations of dictatorship. As authoritarian as the context might be, it's not dictatorship. That's why we are still talking about populism. So dictatorship they left behind. Yes, populists were and are liars, but they left behind the totalitarian level of propaganda and lies that the fascists had presented. In that sense, populists were liars like liberals or communists or other types of politicians. All politicians lie, or lying exists in all political traditions. But in fascism is different because first you have the manufacture of propaganda on massive levels, and then you have, as I explained in my new book, which is already in Brazil. Although I have to say I don't have my copies. I cannot show you the Brazilian edition because I don't have my copy here in New York. So this is the English edition. But in Brazil, the edition was launched by Vestigio publisher of Authentica Group, and I think it's available in Brazil. It is available in Brazil at this point. And what I say there is that fascists believe in their lies, and this is very different. Or they believe let's say, that the lies are at the service of an absolute truth, which is represented by the political religion of the leader, of the myth of the leader. And generally, populists left that behind. They also left behind this centrality of hatred in politics, what used to be called the socialism of the imbeciles. So Perón, for example, will think that being like ascribing centrality to racism and xenophobia was not a good political move, that you will lose voters by engaging in this hatred of hatred that can be presented, that was presented in fascism, in racist, xenophobic, homophobic, misogynistic terms. So that they left behind. And finally, they left behind violence as a kind of end in itself. So they left behind this idea of violence, this glorification of violence, and of course the exercise of violence in such a a radical way. And they also left behind this idea that there was no difference between politics and war. That is to say, the militarization of politics, like politics as the exercise of paramilitary formations, and that is okay to go and be violent to opposition in the street because that's what politics is about. Okay, so they left behind these four elements, which brings us to the question of what's going on now, because what we have seen in leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro and others is that these are populists that have returned to out of the four elements that I just said about fascism: violence, and the militarization of politics, racism, xenophobia, and the centrality of hatred, lies and propaganda, and dictatorship. These new populists like Bolsonaro and Trump, they return to three out of the four elements because they have presented xenophobia and racism and hatred as a key element of their politics. They have returned to the glorification of violence and even the militarization of politics. And these countries have seen, higher levels of repression. They have returned to lies and propaganda in a way that was unprecedented in terms of populist politics. So far, and this is why I will not call them fascists, but rather populist politicians that are getting closer to fascism, or that they represent a danger of fascism, is that so far they have not achieved in terms of what they believe is an achievement, dictatorship. So that is a dimension that has not returned so far. And that's why at this point we should talk about a populism that is as that was never as close to fascism as it is now. And I think this is, of course, extremely worrisome for the present and the future. I will stop there, and now we can, we can engage in a question and answer.
Professor Felippe lost his connection, but thank you, first of all, Professor Finchelstein, for your considerations. I would like to remind the public that they can send their questions to us so we can ask them to the professor. And to begin, Professor Henrique asked about the relationship between the militia perspective with the populists here in Brazil.
I cannot. Sorry. Can you repeat your question? I couldn't hear well.
I was saying that Professor Henrique asked, how do you see the relationship between the militia perspective with the populists here in Brazil, and which similarities and differences it is possible to point out between militia and fascism?
The differences between
militia and fascism.
I think your mic is not very good today. I think the connection. We have connection problems here. I also lost my connection, but I came back. Johanna, just to help you, is the question from Professor Henrique that was asking about the relationship between the militia, the violence aspect of the militias here in Brazil. With Rio de Janeiro, as you know, is a state with a huge numbers of militia groups in poor community. So what's the relationship between militia groups and Bolsonarism?
Yes, I think first we should not think that this is entirely new, meaning this para-state violence or para levels of violence existed in Brazil before Bolsonaro, of course. Like, this is not, but then like this kind of reconfiguration of the relationship between the state and paramilitary groups or para-violence, which is often even enabled by the leader or encouraged by the leader, of course, is extremely worrying. I mean, I have reviewed recently this wonderful book on the history of fascism in Brazil. I just reviewed this like last month for 451. I don't know how you pronounce it. Like the review book, the review magazine. 4.
What's the author, Professor? Is by Pedro
the authors are like Leandro Pereira Gonçalves and Odilon Caldeira Neto, who are like really great historians of integralismo in Brazil. And you remember, for example, the attack on what's the name, like Productora dos Fundos. Give me 1 second. That there was this TV produced Porta dos Fundos. I mean, it is not normal at all. Like you have groups related to integralismo, which are somehow establishing a sort of informal coalition. Do you hear me, Ronaldo? Yes? Are you hear me,
yes,
right?
We hear.
Okay. So what you have, like, I mean, what you have is a kind of new relationship between the leader of a populist, regime and paramilitary groups, paramilitary formations, some of them even neo-fascists or neo-Nazis. And they become sort of fellow travelers of the government. So, I mean, there is a kind of populist fascist coalition, if you will, which is both formal and often informal. I mean, that's why you would probably not have exactly, let's say, Bolsonarista kind of a, you know, groups in the way that the SS work. But still, you have this connection between the state and the leader and paramilitary violence that, of course, shows that this populism is closer to fascism than ever before. That you will not have exactly this in other populist forms. So I think, yes, it's extremely worrying. So what I'm saying is that, for example, when I was teaching in Brazil last year, I mean, many colleagues and students were asking me, why don't you say that Bolsonaro is a fascist? And what I was saying is Bolsonaro is a populist that is one of the closest times that populism has been as never before. Populism has been as close to fascism as it is with people like Bolsonaro. And that is bad enough, and that is worrisome enough. So basically, what I'm saying is that what we are observing, it's a very long history of fascism and populism that at this point, they are together in a way that they were never before after 1945. You cannot talk about Perón in 1943 when he was a dictator and Perón in 1946 when he was an elected president. And in fact, when he was an elected president, he kind of, as I said, left behind these four elements of fascism. And if this was the case of Perón, who was more of a fascist than Vargas, Vargas that had been a dictator and a kind of fellow traveler of fascism, creating his new state on a corporatist way, then he became an elected politician and he behaved very differently. So my point is like this, I mean, in a way, Bolsonaro has many things in common with Hitler and Goebbels that these politicians in populism never had before. And in that sense, again, this history of populism goes, let's say, from Perón and Vargas to the Kirchners and Fernando Collor de Mello. I mean, both neoliberal or right-wing or left populists were not into these four dimensions of fascism. Whereas Bolsonaro, of these four key dimensions of fascism, he certainly checks three of them. I mean, violence, paramilitary violence and the militarization of politics, hate, the politics of hatred, lies and propaganda. But still, there is not the dictatorial dimension. And of course, you could say he will try, but then it's not always up to him. And that's why I always say I'm very hopeful of Brazilians in this sense. Like it's up to you that they don't win. Because if it was up to him, of course he would like to be a dictator. But Brazil is not yet a context for that to happen. And that was also, we can say now, we can be almost sure about this, that in the last 4 years in the US, Trump could not get away with what he wanted to do. He expressed many times that he wanted to remain in power even without elections, and so on and so forth. So my point is that in order for fascism to happen, important elements need to collide. And some of them relate us to the question that I raised before, which is that fascism, for example, won when conservative politicians sided for their own pragmatic reasons with the fascist leader rather than with the constitution. And that's why I think, in that sense, I was kind of hyperbolic about it. But Lula and Cardoso are closer between themselves than with Bolsonaro.
Professor Finchelstein, meanwhile people are preparing their questions, I would like to raise one question that's related to this topic. So you are saying that some leaders like Bolsonaro would like to be maybe a fascist leader, so they would like to govern a dictatorship. Bolsonaro doesn't hide this intention. He praises dictatorship in Brazil. He said several times that
in Paraguay.
In Paraguay, exactly. He said several times that Congress should be closed. And before being the president, and after being the president, after election, as the sitting president, he was riding a horse in Brasilia and he went with some very fascist supporters towards the Supreme Court in Brazil. And not him, but his supporters were holding signs in which we could read, close the Congress, close the Supreme Court. So Bolsonaro was there riding a horse. That's very symbolic as well. Yes, he wanted to overthrow democracy in Brazil, or he wants to. So do we have to consider the institutional strength of our democracies in order to see if the fascist project is viable, is feasible, and even cultural dimensions in the broader polity, body politic. So is it a thing that you consider, like the difference between the willingness of the leader and the institutional strength of the country?
I'm an historian. I'm not a political scientist, so my answer needs to be historical. What I can tell you is that fascism won when a couple of elements were not important enough, and that is to say, as I said, when people on the right identify more with the leaders, or they calculated and certainly sometimes miscalculated in terms of aligning with the leader and not with the law and the constitution. One interesting example of that is Carl Schmitt, who first said this is, we should apply the constitution to repress the Nazis, and then he decided that he will become a Nazi. When eventually the press was and the media were not as strong in presenting all the problematic dimensions of the leader, because there is no between here. There are no two sides. I mean, between racism and xenophobia, homophobia, and misogyny, and the opposition to that. So there is no middle ground. It's not that between, you are neither with those that hate women and with those that do not hate women. There is no middle position there. And when the media did not understand that, and when the media were not necessarily critical of these dimensions in fascist leaders, and when eventually the media was suppressed, fascism was able to win. When the security forces, the police forces and the army and the armed forces, instead of siding the constitution, siding with the constitution, they sided with the whims and the capricious demands of the wannabe dictator, fascism won. When institutions of the state, such as the judiciary, the legal apparatus, or Congress, ignore the constitution, fascism won. When people did not protest in the streets and were apathic about the fate of democracy, fascism won. And when people did not vote enough, fascism won. So my point is, like, all these things happened when there were no political participation, no protest, no media, no support for the independent press, support from institutions of the states that should have sided with the legal order rather than with the wannabe fascist dictator, and so on and so forth. I mean, once you have that, constellation of things, then you have a possibility for fascism to win, or dictatorship to win. I recently was, you know more about this than I know, but when there was a military dictatorship in Brazil, there was no opposition from Congress, from the majority in Congress, for example. And another example, in Argentina, when we had our first coup d'etat in 1930, the Supreme Court decided that it was legal. I mean, when you have this, let's say, betrayal of the Constitution and the law by important sectors of the state and politics, then you have the possibility of fascism being a reality. I mean, imagine all that I said. I mean, and then you ask yourself, is this possible in Brazil? And you have the answer, I don't. Or you are closer to the answer than I am. But fascism is a very complex thing, and it doesn't involve only admiring Stroessner. That's bad enough. But in order for someone like Bolsonaro to reach that stage, it will be involve not only attempting to do so, but also being successful at doing so. But of course, even if you can say, okay, Bolsonaro is trying to do all these things, then perhaps you should call him a fascist. But at this point, it's not clear to me that he's really going full frontal in this regard. So my point is like, there is no, how can I say, he's at the border between fascism and populism. He's very close, but he's not a fascist yet, in my view. And that's my position anyway. So you might call, I would say, okay, someone like Bolsonaro is, as in the history of populism, probably is one of the closest populists to fascism. I think that's bad enough. I don't think we should, I don't think we should, in order to create a, to use or even abuse a concept, presenting him as fascist, we should consider all the things that implies.
Thank you. We have
there was a long question on the
Yes.
chat, but I don't know this platform very well, so I cannot read it. Like perhaps
Okay.
if you read it to me, or
Yes.
where can I find it? I don't know what is the chat.
You can click on the balloon in your right side. Did you see it?
Okay. Yes, I see it.
So you can read. Can you see it? So it
moderators, presenter.
Okay, let me see where you want.
Oh, here, yeah, I see it. Okay, let me see.
I will read it aloud because of the recording.
Okay, please so.
When we watch in the YouTube, they will won't see the question written. I see Biden. Good morning, Professor. I see Biden win in the West as a way to weaken Bolsonaro's way of dealing with international politics in the coming years. So it's about foreign policy. But latest reports show Bolsonaro is still going strong in popularity, with almost 40% of people considering its government as good or great, which is very good for him considering how he dealt with the pandemic and the fires in Pantanal and the Amazon rainforest. Here in Brazil and some countries in Latin America, we have this strong paternalistic relation with our leaders, and it can be a decisive factor for Bolsonaro to maintain his legitimacy as president and even for a re-election. How can you see these two factors, this probable beginning of a new, more center-left leaderships rising in key countries like the US, and the strength of populism and paternalism in Brazil interacting with each other in the next few years?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. It's hard to know the answer. I'm an historian. Again, I'm an expert on the past, not on what's going to happen, and I can always tell you what we can learn from that past in that sense. In any case, we will all agree that the victory of Biden is not good for Bolsonaro. No question about that, because it shows first that this kind of attempt against denigrating democracy can be defeated and was defeated. And again, we should remember that correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of votes, Bolsonaro, in terms of the population, Bolsonaro never got more than 30%. Okay, and even if he reaches a 40% popularity, it all depends how people vote against him. And this again, this implies, and I can easily say this because I'm not Brazilian and I'm not in Brazil, so I sometimes do not share the big, resentment, sometimes understandable, between political, groups. But that's why it's important that they leave these differences aside, and they try to engage in this sort of multi-party coalition, or a group that transcends a particular one form of leadership, and this is very difficult, of course. And it was easier in the US because these at least were many factions within the Democratic Party, as opposed to the Brazilian case. So, I think the floor. The situation is open at this point. I am confident that, and I think also we should support the independent press, even like because this is a new situation. And to me, we should not forget that the fact that that someone like Bolsonaro hates these media because they are presenting facts to the population, and these facts are running against propaganda. Whether they did that before in other governments, I think that should be put aside at this moment. This is not the moment for that, in the sense that, the priority should be, if that is your priority, if you don't, for those that do not agree with hatred, and xenophobia and misogyny and homophobia and that kind of Brazil, in a way, that Bolsonaro is proposing, then all these other things seem to be minor problems, I think. So it's difficult to know what is going to happen, but I would like to believe that more information and more facts can help Brazilians in terms of deciding why this kind of leadership is so problematic for the nation. At least peeling some of those believers in the myth of the leader rather than the facts of the situation. Because at the end of the day, and I think I say this in the introduction to this Brazilian edition of my book on the history of fascist lies, is that at the end of the day, eventually people will have to see, and let's say I'm optimistic in this way, they would have to see that their emperor is naked, that there is no clothing here, that this person has been ignoring a pandemic and producing death, and people die because of him. Even to the extent that I think it is right to ask the question of whether, to the extent that they were responsible for this and even desire these outcomes, people like Trump and Bolsonaro are guilty of mass producing death. So these are very serious situations. And so my point is that, yes, they are able to convince a lot of people by propaganda and lies, but we should, remain confident that, as it happened in the US, at least in this election, let's say truth will prevail and the lies will be ignored by a majority of voters.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Now,
okay.
A more personal thing that I would like to add is that from a Latin, because one of the dimensions in the question was about Latin America, is that at least from my Argentinian perspective, if I can present, put my Argentine hat or my Argentine T-shirt, is that Brazil had a key role in Latin America. It was a regional leader, clearly. And it was like, in terms of Argentina, it was not only its bigger partner, but I think, let's say, and again, like some Argentines might not be able to recognize this, but the fact of the matter was that Brazil, because it's a bigger and more important country, was a key, but not, a key leader in Latin America. And Argentina, or other countries could be helped by Brazil or by the example of Brazil. For example, in managing disease. Without Bolsonaro, Brazil could have been or continue to be a leader in Latin America, a partner and a leader. And I think this, Bolsonaro, I think it's hard to understand why Bolsonaro would prefer to isolate Brazil from the rest of Latin America and ignore a leading role, which in a way was, a leading role in Latin America that in a way presented in many ways no differences, for example, between Lula and Cardoso's leadership. That Brazil was, let me put it this way, Brazil was our senior partner. And Bolsonaro decided to leave behind that role, and it's not that any other Latin American country, or at least in South America, it's not that other countries could occupy that big role that Brazil had. So the situation in Latin America, in a way, is also problematic in that sense, that the most important regional partner of, let's say, smaller Latin American countries, which include, of course, Argentina, which is a smaller country, lost a senior partner. And that is, by design. Bolsonaro wanted that. Bolsonaro did not want to, for Brazil to continue this leading role in the region, which is in a way, you could even say, this is frozen.
Oh, we are seeing you and hearing you as well.
Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
What I was going to say is that Bolsonaro decided for Brazil not to continue a leading role in Latin America, which is, something that even if you are left or right in Brazil, I don't know why you would support that.
Yes. we are still trying to understand this. Our experts in foreign policy in Brazil, it's the most difficult part to understand. It's why Brazil is pursuing a foreign policy that diminishes the Brazilian projection instead of aggrandizing it. I don't know.
It is very strange because, for example, it took probably Argentines like 4 decades to understand that Brazil was the senior partner, that they were not as important as Brazil. I mean, and I think in Argentina that eventually was understood. And to destroy that, I mean, and it was understood by the leading role of Brazil, for example, in Mercosur, and a very collaborative role in Mercosur. But Argentina, I think between the 80s and the 90s, and eventually in the 2000s, I mean, either in the center, the left, or the right, everybody in Argentina understood that Brazil was the senior partner. It was a more important country than Argentina. And to destroy that, I mean, it's very strange, no?
Exactly. Professor, we have just one final question from Brisa that I think you referred to this as well, the relationship between fake news and populist rhetoric. But if you want to say your final remarks and then addressing this question, how can, as you said, truth will prevail in the end. So how can these leaders, Bolsonaro said here in Brazil that the government will not enforce the vaccination of the population, for example, and he doesn't trust in vaccines. So why is this important for his political project? And your final remarks. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a project which is based on propaganda and lies. And he certainly believes that, I mean, it's hard to understand, let's say, outside of the Bolsonaro political religion. I mean, because it's a matter of faith, it's not a matter of empirical demonstration. It is proven that vaccines work, so why this person will decide to continue for Brazilians to die in this context? So that's why I think eventually I'm confident that that enough Brazilians will understand that this is in a way not only terrible for democracy, but terrible for the personal health of the population.
Thank you, Professor. It was very important and very good to hear from you. We have been reading your books for our research here in Brazil. It's very important to have this contact for our students. Is a way to end the semester that's very tough for us, as we are at the new school with the Zoom classes, and we have to deal with a lot of uncertainties, both in our personal lives and our health issues, and then also in our universities and our academic studies. So it's really an honor to have you here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for everyone who joined us for this discussion. And stay safe, people. And do vaccine when you have the opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.